My wife cheated, took everything in the divorce, but she had no idea the trap I was already set. Emily sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window as James drove. Their daughter, Sophie, sat in the back, headphones in, barely acknowledging them. The highway stretched endlessly ahead as they left New York, heading toward the college where Sophie would begin a new chapter of her life. Emily glanced at James, who was focused on the road, his hands steady on the wheel. She once loved those hands. She once loved him. Their marriage had started with passion, built on long nights in a tiny apartment, laughing over cheap wine and big dreams. James had been a junior engineer, barely scraping by, but he had ambition. Emily remembered the way he talked about owning his own business one day, how his eyes burned with determination. And he did it. Over the years, James had built a successful air conditioning company from the ground up. He worked tirelessly, turning a struggling startup into a thriving business. But success had changed him, or maybe it had changed her. As James worked late nights, Emily found herself drawn to something new, something exciting. That something was Ryan, a younger man who made her feel alive again. It started as a simple flirtation, but before long, it became an affair. And once she crossed that line, there was no going back. She had planned everything meticulously. She knew James was worth a fortune now, and she intended to take her share, and more. The divorce would leave her with half of his business, the house, her car, and enough money to ensure she'd never have to work again. James was a fool, she thought, blindly trusting her even when she had already checked out of their marriage. Emily shifted in her seat, stealing a glance at Sophie in the rearview mirror. Their daughter had become distant, cold, even. It wasn't just teenage rebellion. Sophie had been outright hostile, especially after a particular argument that ended with her gripping a kitchen knife so tightly that Emily thought, for a split second, she might actually use it. But Sophie never turned that aggression toward James. No, she adored her father, siding with him in every disagreement. It infuriated Emily. The drive was long, filled with uneasy silence and empty attempts at conversation. When they finally arrived at Sophie's dorm, James helped carry her bags inside while Emily lingered outside, watching other families hugging and saying their goodbyes. She envied their warmth, the kind that had long since left her own home. Sophie barely looked at her as she said, "I'll call Dad if I need anything." "Not them, not you, just Dad." The words stung more than Emily wanted to admit, but she masked it with a forced smile. James didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did and just didn't care anymore. The drive back home was even quieter. James didn't try to talk, and Emily didn't push. Her mind was already on the next step. She had set everything in motion. The moment they got home, everything would change. And she would win. When they pulled into the driveway, the first thing Emily noticed was the sheriff's car parked outside their house. Sheriff Daniel stood by the front door, arms crossed, waiting for them. James frowned, clearly confused, but Emily stepped out of the car with a carefully crafted expression of concern. "James Carter?" Daniel's voice was firm as he approached, holding out an envelope. James took it, his eyes scanning the documents inside. A flicker of confusion crossed his face, then something else, shock. "A restraining order?" he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily folded her arms. "It's for my safety, James." "Your safety?" His gaze lifted, locking onto hers. "What the hell is this, Emily?" She sighed, shaking her head as if this was painful for her. "You've been unpredictable lately. I had to protect myself." It was a lie. A carefully planned lie. She had painted him as controlling, emotionally unstable, dangerous. Enough to convince a judge to grant her the restraining order. Now the house, the business, the money, it was all hers. "I'm also filing for divorce," she continued, her voice steady. "I want half of everything. The business, our savings, the house, my car. And you'll need to pay child support for Sophie." James looked at her like she was a stranger. "You're serious?" he said, more to himself than to her. She straightened. "I'm done, James. This is what's best for me. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside him, clearly expecting a fight. Then, something unexpected happened. James exhaled, folded the papers neatly, and said, "All right." Emily blinked. "What?" "I'll sign them." He walked past her, heading inside without another word. She stood frozen, thrown off by his reaction. She had expected rage, an argument, maybe even some desperate attempt to fix things. But instead, nothing. Just quiet acceptance. Minutes later, James walked out with a single duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He handed Daniel the signed papers without hesitation. Emily stared at him. "That's it?" James met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Yeah. That's it." Then, without another word, he walked away. Emily felt a slow, victorious smile creep across her lips. She had won. She had everything. And James? He had nothing. She had no idea how wrong she was. James walked away without looking back. The moment he stepped out of that house, Emily thought she had won. But what she didn't know, what she could never have imagined, was that James had already seen this coming. Months before Emily served him the divorce papers, Sophie had uncovered the truth. It happened on a quiet afternoon when Emily thought she was alone. But Sophie had doubled back after school to grab something she had forgotten. Instead of an empty house, she walked in on her mother tangled up with Ryan, a man who was very much not her father. Sophie didn't scream. She didn't barge in. Instead, she took out her phone and recorded everything. Every moan, every whispered promise, every betrayal. When she showed the footage to James that night, he sat in silence, staring at the screen. No anger. No outburst. Just a slow, cold realization. Emily had made a mistake. She thought James was a fool. But she had underestimated him. For weeks he said nothing, pretended nothing had changed. But behind the scenes, he was setting his trap, piece by piece. He installed hidden cameras, tracking Emily's movements, her spending, and, most importantly, her secrets. That's when he discovered that Ryan wasn't the only betrayal lurking in their world. Clara, Emily's closest friend, had her own dirty little secret. She was sleeping with Sheriff Daniel's brother. James had everything he needed. He just had to wait for the right moment. After James left, Emily wasted no time enjoying her new life. With half of his business and more than enough money to keep her comfortable, she felt unstoppable. She spent recklessly, lavishing gifts on Ryan, designer clothes, a new watch, an expensive car. She didn't care where the money came from. But what she didn't know was that James had already started bleeding her dry. The first step was her jewelry. While she celebrated her victory, James had replaced all of her valuable pieces with near-identical fakes. The real ones? Sold, converted into cash, hidden where she would never find them. Next came the painting. Emily was proud of it, a gift James had given her years ago, worth hundreds of thousands. What she didn't realize was that the one hanging in her living room now was a masterfully crafted replica, while the original had been carefully removed and sold. Then came the financial trap. Using the access he still had before the divorce was finalized, James took out loans in Emily's name, huge ones. She was too distracted by her new life to notice. Her accounts looked full, but in reality, she was drowning in debt, the payments piling up beneath her nose. And then, when the moment was perfect, James dropped the hammer. He declared bankruptcy. Suddenly, everything that Emily thought was hers, the business, the savings, the assets, was wiped away. The government seized what remained. The house was repossessed. Creditors came knocking, demanding payment for debts she didn't even realize existed. She tried to fight it, but it was useless. The empire she thought she had stolen was nothing more than an illusion, crumbling before her eyes. And James? James walked away clean. But his revenge wasn't finished. Emily still had Ryan, the man she had betrayed her husband for. The man she had thrown everything away for. James made sure she lost him, too. Ryan wasn't as loyal as Emily thought. James had done his research, found the cracks in his past, his debts, his shady dealings, the people he owed money to. It wasn't hard to set things in motion. One phone call, a few well-placed favors, and Ryan was gone. Vanished. Emily searched for him, but there was nothing. No calls, no messages. Just an empty bed and a growing sense of panic. She tried to contact Clara for help, but Clara had her own problems. Because James had leaked the truth about her affair with Sheriff Daniel's brother. Daniel, the man who had so willingly served James those divorce papers, snapped when he found out. Rage consumed him. In a fit of fury, he confronted Clara and his brother, and when the dust settled, both of them were dead. Daniel was arrested that night, his career and his life destroyed in a single moment of blind rage. And Emily? She was alone. The house was gone. The money was gone. Ryan was gone. Clara was dead. Everything she had fought for, everything she thought she had stolen. It had all slipped through her fingers like sand. She had won the battle. But James had won the war. Emily sat in the empty apartment, staring at the blank walls. The air mattress beneath her creaked as she shifted, pulling the tattered blanket tighter around her shoulders. A year ago, she had stood in a mansion, sipping champagne, believing she had won. Now, she had nothing. Ryan was gone. The house was gone. The money was gone. She had tried to fight back, but every door slammed in her face. When she attempted to sell her jewelry, the appraiser smirked and tossed the necklace back at her. Worthless. When she tried to sell the painting, the dealer laughed, pointing out the subtle imperfections that revealed it as a fake. Emily had been living in a fantasy, and James had pulled the rug out from under her. And then, as if that wasn't enough, he dropped the final bombshell. The videos. Private, intimate moments with Ryan, recorded without her knowledge. James didn't even need to explain. He simply let the truth spread. First to her family. Then to her friends. Then to the world. Her father, disgusted, refused to speak to her. Her mother wept, ashamed. The friends she once flaunted vanished, unwilling to be associated with that woman. Emily was ruined. And so, with nowhere left to turn, she fled. Texas wasn't her first choice. It wasn't even her 10th. It was simply where she landed after being evicted for the 3rd time. She found a waitressing job at a rundown diner, serving truckers and drunks who barely left tips. The heels and designer dresses were long gone, replaced by second-hand jeans and cheap sneakers. The woman who once spent thousands on a single handbag now counted every dollar, stretching meals as far as they would go. But even that life didn't last. She was fired after a month when the manager caught her pocketing extra cash from the register. Desperate, she fell further. One night, after a shift at a bar, a man offered her money for something she had never imagined herself doing. She hesitated. Then she thought about the empty fridge, the overdue rent, the fact that she had nobody left. And she said yes. 1 time turned into 2. 2 into 10. And before she knew it, she had fallen into a life she couldn't escape. The woman who once looked down on others now lived in the shadows. And then, one day, she got sick. It started with exhaustion. Then came the weight loss. The night sweats. The fevers that wouldn't break. By the time she finally dragged herself to a clinic, the doctor's expression told her what she already feared. AIDS. The final nail in her coffin. 5 years passed. James stood in a grand hall, watching Sophie dance with her husband. She looked radiant in her wedding dress, happiness shining in her eyes. The young girl who once gripped a knife in anger was now a confident woman, walking into a bright future. James had never been prouder. Beside him, Olivia squeezed his hand, their son playing at their feet. Olivia had been his rock, his second chance at love. With her, he had rebuilt his life, free from the poison of his past. Everything he had lost had been returned to him, tenfold. And then, his phone rang. The voice on the other end was quiet, professional. A doctor. "It's Emily," they said. She's dying. She doesn't have long. She's asking to see you. James stared at the floor, feeling nothing. I won't come, he said after a moment. She just wants to talk. He hesitated. Then, with a sigh, he took the phone and held it to his ear. The voice on the other end was weak, barely above a whisper. James, he said nothing. A ragged breath. A cough. Then a sob. I'm sorry, Emily choked out. For everything. I was stupid. Another cough, harsher this time. I lost everything, James. I lost Sophie. I lost myself. He still said nothing. She sucked in a shaky breath. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. And that I hope you're happy. A long silence stretched between them. Then James finally spoke. I am. The line went quiet. A shuddered exhale, a faint cry. And then nothing. The doctor's voice returned. She's gone. James hung up. He turned back to his family. Sophie was laughing with her husband. Olivia was smiling, their son clinging to her leg. The warmth of their love surrounded him, filling every empty space Emily had once hollowed out. For the first time in years, James truly felt free. And as he pulled his wife and son into an embrace, he smiled. He had won.